Okay, welcome to this edition of the Hot Seat. My name is Mark O'Keefe. I'm executive editor for HeraldStandard.com. With us today is Congressman Mark Kritz. Mark represents the 12th District, which includes much of Fayette County, not all of Fayette County,
Correct.
but also then all of Greene County, parts of Washington,
Parts of a lot of counties.
Yeah, about 6 or 7 other counties, and you're from Johnstown, although I believe your dad grew up in Uniontown,
Yes.
right?
Right. Well, Uniontown is what you tell people who aren't from around here. If they're from around here, you say he's from Oliphant.
Okay,
So,
everybody knows where that's at, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and you had served, I believe you said you started working for Congressman Murtha. You were a long-time aide. You started working in 94, I believe you
I
said.
started volunteering for him in 94, yes.
Volunteering in 94, and then you end up working for him starting back in 2001.
Correct,
So-
on the congressional staff, that's
So
correct.
then you worked for him for 10 years.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the congressman passed away. So then you ran, it was a special election,
Correct.
which you had to run. And then you had to run
Again.
and the special election was last spring.
Correct, May.
And then you had to run again in November in the election.
In the general, yes.
For the 2-year, for the official
correct.
2-year term, which you're now serving. So the thing to me is that, you know, so you're not somebody who's like a newcomer, never been to Washington, D.C. or Congress or whatever. You've been there. You've seen a lot of things, I'm sure. So what is it about maybe Congress that you think has really changed or maybe even kind of surprised you? Everybody talks about the partisanship.
Yeah.
Is it kind of as bad as it's made out to be? And
Well, I would frame it with 2 different statements. One being that actually starting with Newt Gingrich. When Newt Gingrich came in 90, they won the 94 election, all sworn in 95 is when the Republicans took the majority. Newt Gingrich started taking the power away from committee chairmen and focusing everything in the leadership. Dennis Hastert continued that process, and then on the Democratic side, Nancy Pelosi actually, I think, refined it so that everything we do now in the House goes through leadership. Now, Speaker Boehner is appearing like he's trying to push the power back down to the committee chairman, but it really hasn't manifested because there's so much bickering going on right now. So I think that is really the solution, is that in years past, committee chairmen had some autonomy themselves so that everything wasn't through leadership, which meant that it was, you know, just by definition partisan, that it was the Democratic or the Republican leadership. So that's, I think, what I'm experiencing now, and actually what Congressman Murtha experienced in the last, 15 years of his career was this move towards everything goes through leadership. Committee chairmen don't have their own autonomy. The second thing that I would say, and actually this is something that I've come to realize over the past actually several months, is that in years past, nobody got to see how Congress worked. Most people just got to see what the final product was. Well, now with the 24-hour news cycle, C-SPAN and everything, people actually get to see the fighting that goes on in Congress. And the analogy that I like to use is that if anyone actually ever saw how sausage was made, they probably wouldn't eat it because it's not a pretty sight. Well, what we do in Congress sometimes is like making sausage, is that there's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of bickering that goes on because we do have our own ideologies and we're going to fight for our point of view. But at the end of the day, something does come out. So I think that what people are saying is Congress is dysfunctional at this point. Well, I think what they're getting to see is that it's always been dysfunctional. You just get to see it happen now. But and now with that, I'm going to qualify it as I think we've gone a little over the edge recently. I mean, I think some of the bickering is really, if you want to talk about things like the debt ceiling, I mean, putting the economy of the country in jeopardy. That's not partisan politics. I think that's just unpatriotic.
that had been something that had been done in the past fairly routinely, the
Correct.
debt ceiling. And I guess kind of in a way, maybe, I don't know, maybe some people maybe thought that there wouldn't be that big of a deal with it, although I guess
Yeah.
others maybe could have foreseen that the Republicans would try and make this a big issue. And what were some of your thoughts about the debt ceiling?
Well, I joined with about 50 other colleagues, and we sent a letter to the president. We sent a letter to the leadership, both Democratic and Republican, and said, let's just pass a clean debt ceiling, just raise the debt ceiling, and let's work on the budget afterwards. And that never manifested. There were a bunch of votes about raising the debt ceiling, but there was always some sort of, like, we'll call junior high language attached to it, or some other spending provisions that were attached to it. And that's not a clean debt ceiling. We started talking about this back in April. Let's just take care of it. Let's get it out of the way, and then let's work on the cuts in funding or the cuts in spending that we need to do, and look at our long-term issues. What was interesting is that the Republicans' leadership attached all this spending to the debt ceiling. Well, I mean, we do have issues with the long-term sustainability of Social Security, of Medicare. These are programs that we do have to evaluate and make some changes to. I think some of the ones that have been proposed by the Republican leadership are sort of go too far. I think we can do some minor things to extend the viability, but we do have to do something. I mean, we know that 2037 is a big date for Social Security. I read just in the paper the other day 2017 for Social Security disability. Medicare is another one. Well, when the Republicans attached all this to the debt ceiling vote, it actually gave everyone an opportunity to say, we've got some big decisions to make. Well, let's use this framework and this table to start addressing that kind of stuff. And then it is bipartisan. It is us sitting down saying, okay, what are the long-term decisions we have to make? Well, then Eric Cantor picked up and left. And then, then John Boehner walked away and said, no, we're going to go back to the House and we're going to create our own thing. And, he had to work with his own party just to get the legislation that he said he was going to pass, to get it passed. He had to give them some sweeteners to say, for it to work it out. So it became this partisan mess, and we ended up with, what we ended up with was, at the end of the day, 95 Democrats voted for the final deal. Did we like it? Absolutely not. The cuts are pretty deep in a lot of programs that we think are important, but at the end of the day, we weren't going to let the country go default on its obligations.
Well, it almost seemed that the Republicans, to some degree, were just trying to use this as some kind of an issue that they didn't really care, like
Yeah.
how much maybe it hurt the economy or whatever. That they were just trying to make this point, and that's it seems to me that in the past you did have a lot more sense of compromise, and maybe you would try and get your point passed or whatever, and certainly the Republicans are the majority in the House, so that makes it somewhat difficult. But it just seems like it's almost this no prisoners.
Well, it's interesting that we're meeting today. We just dedicated the George C. Marshall Post Office, the renaming of the post office, and there's so many quotes that I went through where he was talking about stepping up, and it's about country.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he at one point for President Roosevelt was managing the Civilian Conservation Corps camps in the South and in the Pacific Northwest, and a lot of Army officers didn't want to do it because it wasn't good for their careers. And he said, well, this is part of our country. We have to do this. So he stepped up, and of course he went on to be very successful. But there's a quote, and I carry it around in my pocket actually. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican minority leader, made a comment that they looked at the debt ceiling that some of the far right of the party had said that the debt ceiling vote was a hostage that they could shoot. Well, Mitch McConnell said, well, no, a lot of us didn't think that, but we realized that it's a hostage that we can ransom. And I thought to myself, I think that's partisan politics at its absolute worst, is that you're talking about the well-being of our nation. And if you're talking about using our economy as a hostage to ransom your ideology, that's not what this country's about. It's about us pulling together, and the way I view it is shared sacrifice. I talk to a lot of people on Social Security, and they're concerned about a lot of these debates. But if you ask any one of them saying, look, if everyone pitches in, would you be willing to not get a raise or to do this or that? And the vast, vast majority of them, these are people that aren't wealthy by any stretch, say that, if everyone's pitching in, I would be happy to pitch in myself. Well, what we saw from the Republicans wasn't that sentiment, and it's very discouraging, especially being a fairly new guy on the elected side, even though I've worked with Congress quite a bit.
Well, being in, working with Congressman Murtha, being on his staff, I mean, so do you think that this is a new kind of thing too with the Republicans? I mean, had you seen them be more conciliatory and more, kind of work together previously?
Well, I think what you saw and we'll go back to the Newt Gingrich, the Republican Revolution, if you remember the Contract for America, or a lot of Democrats call it the Contract on America. It's not to be funny, but at the end of the day, Newt Gingrich and the leadership worked with President Clinton to come up with some of the things that they did. And at the end of it, we had an economy that was booming. We had surpluses coming into the government coffers. What we have today is that these new freshmen are uncompromising. I mean, they will not sit down and say, well, I understand that there's 435 other members of Congress that think a little differently than I do. I've got to pick my spot and work with them to come up with a solution. No, they're saying, this is where we are. We're not coming to you. You have to come to us. And that's really, they actually, for lack of a better term, sort of took over the Republican Party, because the leadership then was stuck. They couldn't get the votes to pass their legislation unless they acquiesced to the Republican far right.
Mm-hmm. And I guess too, one of the things is Congressman Murtha was always somebody who was always able to reach out
Absolutely.
and work with Republicans. So you got to wonder, like, what he would think of the
he'd
current,
be so frustrated by this.
current
And actually,
situation.
that's how I was brought up, is that I'm working in Congress for the country, for my district, for Pennsylvania. And actually, in Pennsylvania, we work together real well, Democrats and Republicans. We look at our group, the 19 members of Congress, as we're working for Pennsylvania. So we stick together and we try to do what's best for Pennsylvania in the overall context of what's best for the country. Now, there is a group of people that think what these far-right people are talking about is the answer. There's a whole bunch of other people who don't. So, and that's what, you look at the constitutional debates, you look at Henry Clay in the 1800s. I mean, it's about coming to some sort of compromise that you don't get everything you want, but you get some of the stuff, and you work with the other side to come to some sort of agreement that, at the end of the day, is good for the country.
Mm-hmm. So where do you think that in these kind of freshmen, I guess Tea Party people is what they kind of call themselves, so do you see any hope at all? Do you know any of them, or have you had a chance to meet with them? Or,
well, and that's the interesting part of Congress, is that because I came in a special last year, I didn't get to go with any freshman class on any kind of orientation. So they allowed me to go with the current class that got sworn in January to a freshman retreat. So I got to meet a lot of them. They're good guys, good women, family people, just that their ideology drives almost everything that they do. And I've met some that are really willing to sit down and work. In fact, one of the caucuses is the Marcellus Shale Gas Caucus, and I co-chair it with a guy from New York, Tom Reed, a Republican, and we've worked together on a lot of things. Another guy from Colorado is the chairman on a subcommittee that I'm the ranking member on. And we agree on a lot of different things, but there are times where he just goes ideological and he can't come to the center or come towards the center to work on things. So my fear is that there's a large enough group of them that will not compromise, and therefore you end up with this either stalemate or a lot of the Congress sitting there and saying, we're stuck. We can't legislate on the behalf of the American people because this small group has sort of stymied everything that's happening.
Okay, we're going to take a break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to this edition of The Hot Seat. My name is Mark O'Keefe. I'm executive editor for HeraldStandard.com, and our guest today is U.S. Representative Mark Kritz, Democrat representing the 12th Congressional District, which, as we said before, includes much of Fayette County, all of Greene County, and parts of Washington, Westmoreland, Somerset,
Cambria, Indiana, Armstrong, and Allegheny.
So
actually,
it extends pretty far there. And you were
it's ugly.
You were elected well, you'd been a longtime aide to former longtime Congressman John Murtha, and then you were elected in a special election last spring, and then you were elected into a full 2-year term in the November general election.
Correct.
So, and just talking about, we're talking about the debt ceiling vote and just how frustrating that was, that something that had been fairly routine in the past became very, very complicated, and at some points seemed like it was never going to pass. Correct. Or whatever, and it did end up passing. And there was, I guess one of the things is there's a committee, Super
Correct.
12 or whatever senators, I believe, that are going
Well,
to.
6 senators and 6 U.S.
Okay.
and 6 House members.
Okay, so
and
they're going
6 Republicans and 6 Democrats.
What do you think of that? I mean, because it's almost like someone's going to have to change their positions or whatever for anything to be done. Do you see anything positive coming out of this at all?
Well, I'm hopeful. And going back, just to frame it a little bit, going back to the debt ceiling vote, someone asked me before the vote if I thought we were going to go past the deadline, and I actually had predicted that we would. I really thought that the Republicans would hold that hostage just to see what would happen, which is frightening to me, but they didn't. So I saw some hope in there. And like I said, 95 Democrats voted for the compromise. About 175, I think, Republicans voted for it. So they lost some of theirs. We got half of our delegation. But this committee of 12, which is 3 Republicans in the House, 3 Democrats in the House, 3 Republican senators, 3 Democratic senators, they know how important this is, and it's been communicated via the leadership, via the presidency, via the media, via constituents, that they have to come up with something. This is not something where someone can say, well, we're not doing what I want, so I'm going to leave the table. They know that they have to develop a product. So I'm very hopeful that they do. Otherwise, the way the bill was passed is that these cuts will become mandatory that have been defined, and some of those are Medicare and things that, really, in all honesty, most of my constituency relies on. So, I'm very hopeful. We are fortunate in Pennsylvania that Senator Toomey, a brand new senator, is on that committee, so I'm hopeful that he'll keep sort of Pennsylvania in mind when he's thinking about it. We're a very diverse state, and we have a lot of issues, and I think that that's a good framework, a good base to work from.
You talked about, I mean, obviously there is a need to cut spending somewhat.
Yes.
And, you have Social Security kind of maybe teetering on the edge down the road there. Well, what do you think needs to be done, or what kind of cuts or changes do you think?
Well, it's interesting because this is actually things I talked about during the campaign. One is that Democrats and Republicans have to work together. We have our ideologies, but at the end of the day, it's about the country. So we can come together, and you talk about things like Social Security. Well, we have different ideas on what the best way forward is, but working together, we can come up with reasonable solutions. But when it comes to cuts, and I talked about this last year, and I continue to talk about it, through the Clinton-Gore years, they actually started a program, and they called it right-sizing government, is that as people retired, they didn't replace them. So they started to shrink the size of government through attrition, that agencies had to become more efficient. They were forced to because they weren't getting the budgets to maintain a level of staffing. Well, through the 2000s, through the Bush years, government really grew exponentially. And so now you have all these inefficiencies, and you have all these programs that could be run much better. But when someone says, hey, we're going to give you extra money, or you're allowed to grow your staff, no one's going to say no. So I think that strategy of, okay, let's look at this long term, and I say this to people wherever I talk, is that it took 10 years to get here. It's going to take at least 10 years to get out of it. And we can start that. Let's start shrinking the size of government, making agencies more efficient. And this is one of the ones that comes up, especially in this area, is about defense. Do people think that the defense industry in our area is going to be impacted? Obviously, there's going to be some impact, but I think it's going to be smaller because I think the efficiencies at the Pentagon can be through support services. There's a lot of support services out there that are not making a product. They're the ancillary things. And the more efficient they make that, the smaller that portion of the budget can be. And I think that's where we need to do. It's really about efficiency. It's like running a business. How can we put out the same product with either less people, less money, or in a quicker amount of time?
What about what about Social Security and Medicare? And do you favor anything as far as raising the age limits, or also to raising the income levels?
A couple of things about Social Security. Well, it's about all those. Is that right now the cap on the wage at which Social Security tax is taken out is $106,800, I think. It's or $108,000. It's right in that range. And when they set that limit, if they'd have just indexed it to inflation, it would be at $165,000 right now. I don't have any qualms with raising the wage at which Social Security taxes are taken out. Now in this position, I fall into a category that some of my wage doesn't have Social Security tax taken out. But most of it is, and that's a myth too. A lot of people don't think that members of Congress pay into Social Security. We do, and we're part of the retirement plan as well, the Social Security retirement plan. But raising the retirement age is one of those ones where I'm against it, simply because so many of my constituents swing a hammer or use a shovel or are on their feet all day long. Now, if they're sitting on their rear ends at a desk all day, you could work another year. It's, most likely. I mean, there are, of course, circumstances. But if you're using your back or your body for work, even 65 is hard to get to. So I think that should be a last resort, that we only do that if we have to. I think raising the income level and looking at future benefits is a way to stabilize Social Security. Medicare, it's much more immediate. And the biggest problem with Medicare is that healthcare costs have gone up so dramatically. We have to get our arms around healthcare costs. And it's one of those things where a lot of people like to point the finger at insurance companies. Medicare pays about 50% of all healthcare bills. Medicare is part of the problem. Therefore, Medicare has to be part of the solution. Insurance companies are usually dragged along with whatever Medicare is doing. So although you can't budget when they're raising your rates 18, 20%, Medicare has to be part of how do we lower healthcare costs and improve outcomes. I mean, someone gave me a statistic the other day that we're about 23rd in the quality of our healthcare in the world, but we spend more on healthcare than any country in the world. So we have some issues there. We don't have a lot of time to address that, but we have to come up with a plan that puts it on a track for solvency. Privatizing, doing anything like that is, I think, off the table. It's off the table for me.
And so what about, has been suggested as far as, raising taxes on the people making like over $250,000 a year, that sort of thing? What are some of your thoughts about that?
Well, this is one of the things, and I was talking before about, I'm trying to keep my answers short and concise, but you start learning more about issues, and you learn more facets about it. I think Warren Buffett was saying exactly what a lot of people are thinking, is that the very top are actually getting a break compared to the people who work for them. And so there's got to be this balance. And I'd said it before that I talk to people who are on Social Security. It's about shared sacrifice. If everyone's pitching in, everyone's willing to pitch in. And I grew up middle class, and maybe even a lower middle class. And it always seems like the middle class is the one who bears the burden of any solutions that government comes up with. So I think we need to look at those Bush tax cuts. The argument that I hear that's extremely aggravating to me is that you can't raise taxes on the job creators. Well, we got 9% unemployment. These tax breaks have been in since 2001. Where are the jobs? I mean, if it's that beneficial to our economy, where are the jobs? Another one is that 2.9 million manufacturing jobs have been created by American companies in foreign countries. We've lost 2.1 million manufacturing jobs in this country. So we've got a paradigm, an environment that we have to figure out a better way to do it. And I guess a way to approach it as well is that we've got to revisit the corporate tax rate. If you're a small business, you're not going to be able to take advantage of every loophole that's in there. So you're paying the 35%. If you're a big business, you're taking advantage of every loophole, and your effective rate's 18%. Well, that's not fair. That's not fair to anybody. So we've been talking about eliminating all the loopholes, but then lowering the corporate tax rate so that it does spur economic development. So there's a lot of tax things on the table. I'm no expert. You know, I'm learning a lot of this as I go. This is not something that I have specialized in my college career and my business career. So I'm trying to be as smart as I can and listen to the experts and what their suggestions are.
Well, as you mentioned about the unemployment in Fayette County here, we're about 9%,
Yeah.
which is pretty much about where the country's at, I guess. But you know, we've traditionally had higher unemployment here. And the thing that you see is really manufacturing is pretty much gone. You know, you used to have a lot of plants and making different things, and these days you just don't see that. And a lot of these jobs, like you said, have gone overseas. What do you think can be done to try and bring some of this manufacturing back, or is it just gone forever?
Yeah. Well, I actually had a big discussion with some small businesses in the northern part of my district the other day, and you know, you have to look back in history, and actually, you know, talking about a whole lot of things is that a lot of history can show you what your actions might bring. You know, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the United States had lots of natural resources, cheap labor, and all the industry that was in Europe came to the United States. So what's happening, we talk about China and these other countries, what's happening to us is pretty similar to what happened to them then. So we have to be smart about what we do, and doing things like looking at the corporate tax rate is a step in the right direction. And part of what I've been hearing is that we've put all these small business programs into play. You know, they can amortize a capital investment in 1 year, which is huge, that they can spend money on capital, small business can spend money on capital, amortize it for their taxes in 1 year. It's a huge tax break. But then on the other side, we have all these new banking regulations that makes it tough for banks to loan money to small businesses. So in one instance, we're improving things for small business and the economy, but on the other hand, we're making it tougher for the banks to lend money to small business, which they need to make those capital improvements. So a lot of times we're spinning our wheels in the sand. We have to get rid of the instability. You know, the healthcare law has created a lot of questions as to what the future will look like. The Dodd-Frank banking bill created a lot of, nobody's really certain what's going to roll out. So it makes it tough for businesses to think about those kind of things. Is that, well, do I invest? I don't know what's going to happen next year. So we got to get rid of the uncertainty and work from there.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that, you know, is there anything that you think could be passed, you know, through this Republican Congress that the Democrats would be in agreement with, or, you know, do you see any hope at all of any kind of compromise?
Well, I'm hopeful. I mean, I think at the end of the day, and I think this August recess, where members of Congress are in their districts listening to their people, hopefully the people on the fringes will be hearing from their constituents that we need to get something done. And you know, being from this part of the country, I mean, we've been talking about jobs and economic development since steel left in the late 70s and early 80s. So we've been through this, we've lived it for most of our adult lives. You know, I think the country's getting that, is that a lot of the problems we're experiencing, like Social Security, Medicare, the more people that are working, the more people that are paying in, the easier it is to make some of the decisions. They're not huge decisions, or they are huge decisions, but they're easier to solve. So I'm hopeful.
Well, I guess you know, people in Fayette County would join you in hoping that something can be done. But that's going to wrap up our show today. I want to thank U.S. Representative Mark Kritz, the Democrat from the 12th District, for coming on our show today. And I want to thank you for watching. My name is Mark O'Keefe. I'm Executive Editor for HeraldStandard.com. We'll see you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.